Stop! Hold on a second. You think you know about the most famous kings and queens in history. The ones with the crowns, the castles, the wealth? Well, what if I told you some of the most powerful rulers in history didn't just sit on thrones? They crossed lines that no one should ever cross. Forget what Hollywood tells you. The real stories, far worse. Before you get too comfortable, I need you to do something. Hit that like button if you want to dive into the dark side of history, and drop a comment below if you've ever wondered what was really going on behind those palace walls. I'll wait. All right, dim the lights, get comfy, and let's jump in because what's coming next is gonna make your jaw drop. Number 1. The reign of King Richard II. In the 14th century, the court of King Richard II of England wasn't your typical royal setting. Richard, a young, impulsive king, took the throne with a promise of prosperity. But beneath his crown was a deep-seated need for control, one that would grow beyond reason. Pervasive Richard's reign became infamous for its excesses, wild parties, extravagant feasts, and a twisted obsession with domination. His indulgence in luxury wasn't about enjoyment. It was about asserting his absolute power over the nobility. The court became a stage for his need to control not just his kingdom, but his own image. Yet, the paranoia grew. Richard purged anyone who even looked at him the wrong way, and as his rule spiraled out of control, it was rebellion, not riches, that became his undoing. His reign, meant to be glorious, turned to ashes, a victim of the very power he thought he could wield. Number 2. The madness of King John of France. King John of France wasn't just a ruler. He was a man lost in the chaos of his own desires. Imagine waking up in a palace, surrounded by wealth, yet driven to madness by paranoia and obsession. John's court was notorious not for its grandeur, but for its bizarre indulgences. The king's need to control wasn't just political, it was personal, especially in the lives of the women around him. His reign was defined by debauchery, as he used his power not only to manipulate the kingdom, but to dominate the pleasure of those closest to him. But it didn't stop at orgies and lavish feasts. His paranoia consumed him, turning his court into a place of constant fear. John's reign, full of promise at first, spiraled into madness, and in the end, he wasn't remembered for his victories, only for the twisted control he exerted over everything he touched. Number 3. The scandal of King Henry VIII. The name Henry VIII is synonymous with scandal. This is a king who made headlines not for his military victories or wisdom, but for his obsession with his own desires. Famous for his 6 marriages, Henry's quest for power wasn't about ruling, it was about control over his bloodline and legacy. But Henry's madness wasn't confined to the bedroom. His reign was about domination. He used his marriages as political chess pieces, manipulating them to secure his hold on the throne. Each marriage, each beheading was a calculated move in his personal power game. This was a man who didn't just reshape England's religion, he shaped its very existence, bending it to his will. The world would never look at a monarch the same way again, after seeing what Henry was willing to destroy to fulfill his desire for a son. Number 4. The debauched life of King Louis XIV. Welcome to Versailles, the grand palace of King Louis XIV. But it wasn't just a palace. It was a stage for the king's performance of absolute power. Louis wasn't just a king. He was the Sun King, the center of everything. Louis understood one thing. Control was the key to maintaining his position, and indulgence was a tool he used masterfully. His court was a spectacle of lavish excess, yet it wasn't just about wealth. It was about control through decadence. Louis used his sexual exploits as a political strategy. His mistresses weren't just for pleasure. They were integral players in the game of French politics. And, as his reign progressed, the lines between pleasure and politics blurred, creating an empire built on manipulation and fear. Number 5. Sultan Ibrahim the Mad. When obsession becomes rule. Sultan Ibrahim I, known as the Mad Sultan, wasn't just obsessed with power. He was consumed by his desires. As the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, Ibrahim had everything at his fingertips. Yet it wasn't enough. Women. He didn't just rule with political force. He ruled through his insatiable need to possess. The harem became his playground, and he was the self-appointed master. But his obsession with morbidity went even further, and in the darkest moments of his reign, he ordered the execution of 280 concubines, drowning them in the Bosphorus, all because of a simple suspicion. Empire wasn't a place of glory, it was a kingdom of destruction. His reign was defined not by military conquest, but by his destructive thirst for control over the most intimate parts of life. Number 6. The depraved Sultan Murad IV, banning everything that gave him pleasure. Sultan Murad IV of the Ottoman Empire took control not by indulgence, but by the complete opposite. He believed that true power came from eliminating pleasure entirely. Murad banned everything: alcohol, tobacco, even games of chess. And if you were caught doing any of these sins, you faced execution. The Sultan's obsession with purging pleasure from his empire wasn't just moral, it was psychological. Yet despite his moral crusade, Murad was a heavy drinker himself, living in contradiction to everything he forced his people to believe. His reign wasn't about reform, it was about control, using the weapon of moral superiority to instill fear and obedience across his empire. Number 7. The Mad Emperor Tiberius, a ruler lost in power and paranoia. Let's travel back to ancient Rome to meet Emperor Tiberius, a ruler whose reign is remembered for its gradual descent into paranoia, cruelty, and isolation. At the start of his reign, Tiberius was a skilled leader, respected for his military strategy and governance. However, after he withdrew to the island of Capri, his personality underwent a dark transformation. Tiberius, once known for his wisdom, became increasingly consumed by distrust and suspicion. His paranoia grew uncontrollable, and he saw enemies everywhere. In his later years, Tiberius's rule became infamous for his brutal treatment of those he perceived as threats. Many were accused of treason, often without proof, and faced severe punishment. His reign, marked by fear and unpredictability, left a scar on the Roman Empire. Tiberius's death was as chaotic as his reign. He was suffocated by his own guards, marking the violent and tragic end of a rule defined by tyranny and suspicion. His legacy is a cautionary tale of power unchecked and the madness that can follow when a leader loses control. Number 8. The reign of Tsar Ivan VI, the child king who was imprisoned for life. Let's move to Russia, where we meet Tsar Ivan VI, a king who never had the chance to rule. At just 2 years old, Ivan was crowned emperor, but his reign was more of a tragedy than a kingdom. Born into the Romanov dynasty, Ivan's parents were swiftly overthrown, and he became a puppet ruler for those who wanted to manipulate his position. By the time Ivan was 3, Empress Elizabeth of Russia overthrew him and locked him away in isolation for the next 23 years. For more than 2 decades, Ivan lived in a tiny room, unable to experience the power he once held, surrounded by neglect and total isolation. Eventually, Ivan was murdered, a tragic end for a boy who was never given the chance to rule his empire. His life was one of betrayal and loss, a tragic reminder of what happens when power is taken away before a person has a chance to even understand it. Number 9. The story of Queen Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess. Let's shift to Hungary, where Elizabeth Bathory, the infamous Blood Countess, left a mark on history that can only be described as nightmarish. Elizabeth, a noblewoman with wealth, power, and beauty, began to fear that age would rob her of her looks. Desperate to retain her youth, she broke the bounds of humanity itself. Believing that bathing in the blood of virgins would grant her immortality, she hunted young women to fulfill her twisted obsession. Over the years, she and her accomplices are said to have tortured and killed hundreds of young girls. Their bodies were mutilated, their blood drained, and their lives discarded, as Elizabeth believed it was her right to defy nature itself. Her reign of terror continued until authorities were tipped off. She was arrested, but her crimes had already scarred history forever, her name forever associated with sadism and the darkest corners of power. Number 10. The tragic story of King George III, a king consumed by madness. Next, let's move to Britain, where King George III, once a promising and respected monarch, became the subject of one of the most tragic stories of a ruler losing everything to a debilitating illness. George began his reign with a clear vision to strengthen Britain's position globally. He was a popular king in his early years, loved by the people for his hard work and commitment to the nation. But as time passed, something changed. George began to experience episodes that were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. He would have wild mood swings, sudden fits of paranoia, and suffer from hallucinations. At first, these episodes were dismissed, but as they became more frequent and severe, it became clear that the king was mentally ill. His sudden outbursts and confusion alienated him from his advisors, and, in time, he was no longer able to rule the empire. His son, the Prince Regent, was forced to take over the throne, and George spent the last years of his life isolated, a tragic figure in the history of British monarchy. The man who once had the world at his feet was now forgotten by his own country, remembered not for his accomplishments, but for his mental decline and the loss of the American colonies under his reign. Number 11. The reign of Queen Mary I, the Bloody Mary. Next, we head to England, where the name Mary I is forever tied to bloodshed and religious fanaticism. Often known as Bloody Mary, her reign was marked by brutality and fear. Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, faced the task of restoring Catholicism in a kingdom already divided by her father's break from the church. What she didn't realize, however, was that her obsessive need to revert England to Catholicism would lead to a reign of terror and mass executions. Mary's most infamous act was the Marian persecutions. during which over 280 Protestants were burned at the stake and thousands more were exiled. These public executions were meant to enforce religious conformity, but they instead sowed hatred, fear, and division. The brutal killings earned her the name Bloody Mary, and she became a symbol of religious extremism, someone who used power not to unite, but to punish those who dared to think differently. Mary's reign lasted only 5 years, but the bloodshed she caused marked a dark chapter in English history, and her legacy was forever tainted by her cruelty and violence. Number 12. The Mad Queen. Catherine de' Medici, the manipulator of France. Now, let's focus on Catherine de' Medici, a woman who knew how to maneuver in the dangerous world of French politics. Born into a noble family, Catherine married Henry II of France and became a queen consort. But after her husband's untimely death, Catherine would rise to power, controlling the throne through her children and manipulating her way to the top. Her rule was marked by ruthless political strategy, using marriage alliances and backroom deals to cement her power. But Catherine's greatest and most infamous act came with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The French wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants were tearing the country apart, and Catherine saw an opportunity to eliminate her Protestant enemies. In one bloody night, thousands of Huguenots, French Protestants, were slaughtered across France. Catherine's political manipulation created the conditions for one of the most brutal religious purges in European history. It was a massacre, and it was all done for power. De' Medici was a master manipulator, willing to sacrifice anyone, including her own family, for control. She was the queen who understood that, in the Game of Thrones, mercy had no place. She ruled with fear and calculation, a queen who held the crown but never hesitated to drown the kingdom in blood to keep her family on the throne. Number 13. The Mad Emperor Caligula, a reign fueled by insanity and lust. Let's now enter the world of Caligula, the mad emperor of Rome whose name has become synonymous with insanity, excess, and violence. When Caligula ascended to the throne, the people of Rome had high hopes, but soon the emperor's power became more of a nightmare than a blessing. Caligula was obsessed with power, but not in the traditional sense. His reign wasn't about governance, it was about gratification. His need to be adored was boundless. He believed himself to be a god, and those around him had no choice but to worship him. The emperor took sadistic pleasure in humiliating his subjects. He made sexual exploitation a public affair and used it as a means of asserting his dominance. His infamous orgies were not only indulgent, they were his political tool. But Caligula didn't stop there. His paranoia led him to eliminate anyone he deemed a threat, and his reign was filled with murders, executions, and exile. Even his own family wasn't safe. He appointed his horse, Incitatus, as a consul to mock the Senate, demonstrating his total disregard for authority. In the end, Caligula was assassinated by his own guards, a tragic end to a reign defined by madness and depravity. His empire, once full of promise, had been consumed by the emperor's insatiable desires. Number 14. The reign of King Leopold II, the king who ruled with death. Let's now turn to King Leopold II of Belgium, a man whose rule over the Congo Free State is one of the darkest and most inhumane chapters in colonial history. Leopold's empire wasn't one of conquest and glory. It was an empire of exploitation and slavery. He took control of the Congo as his personal possession, where he established a brutal regime based on forced labor. The people of the Congo were enslaved to harvest rubber, and those who didn't meet their quotas were punished in the most horrific ways. Families were separated, villages destroyed, and millions died due to disease, starvation, and brutal treatment. He used violence and terror to control the population, with the help of his personal army, the Force Publique. Their mission was clear: force, labor, or death. The king's reign over the Congo was a genocide. hidden behind the veil of colonialism. Leopold's name is forever associated with mass murder, exploitation, and greed. His legacy of cruelty lives on in the scars he left behind. Number 15. Final thoughts on power, madness, and corruption. So, what do we see when we look at these rulers, Caligula, Mary I, Catherine de' Medici, and Leopold II? The corruption of power, the madness that ensues when people crave control to the point of destruction. Rulers didn't just abuse their power, they were consumed by it. Caligula's sadistic indulgences, Mary I's religious purges, Catherine de' Medici's manipulations, and Leopold II's genocidal empire all show the dangers of absolute power. Power unchecked can corrupt not just the ruler, but the entire kingdom. These stories serve as warnings about what happens when leaders let their egos and obsessions destroy everything around them. In the end, these rulers don't just represent the fall of empires, they represent the darkness that lies within when power and madness collide. Number 16. The reign of King Ivan the Terrible. Power, paranoia, and murder. Let's travel to Russia, where we meet Ivan IV, more commonly known as Ivan the Terrible. His reign is one of the most infamous in history, marked not only by violence and bloodshed, but also by a paranoid obsession with control. Ivan came to the throne as a young, ambitious leader, but his desire for absolute power quickly turned into something darker. His reign was filled with brutal purges of the nobility, his closest allies, and even his own family. He believed betrayal was lurking around every corner, and so he eliminated anyone he thought might threaten his authority. Didn't stop with his own court. Ivan turned his terror on the people as well. He formed an elite secret police, the oprichniki, who were tasked with rooting out any perceived dissent and using torture and death as their tools. Entire villages were destroyed in his pursuit of total domination. But perhaps the most tragic moment of Ivan's reign came when he killed his own son in a fit of rage. After an argument, Ivan struck his son in the head, fatally wounding him. The loss of his heir marked the beginning of the decline of Ivan's power. His madness, paranoia, and cruelty had eaten away at his legacy until he was no longer feared, only pitied. Ivan's name became a symbol of tyranny, a ruler who was so consumed by fear and anger that he destroyed not only his enemies, but also his own family and empire. Scene 17. The tragic madness of King Charles VI of France. Now let's head to France, where King Charles VI, also known as Charles the Mad, ruled during a time of great turbulence. Unlike the others, Charles's story is not one of cruelty or ambition, but rather a tragic fall from grace due to a mental illness that ravaged both his mind and his kingdom. Charles was a king of promise, but by the age of 24, he began to show signs of insanity. Episodes of delirium became more frequent, and soon he started experiencing paranoia and hallucinations, believing that those around him were out to kill him. At times, he would forget he was king and act as though he was living in a different time. One of his worst episodes, he attacked his own men and saw everyone as an enemy. As his mental state deteriorated, Charles could not rule, and his wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, had to take control of the kingdom in his stead. The 100 Years' War raged on, and factions within France sought power, using Charles's madness as a tool for their own gain. But the most tragic aspect of Charles's reign was that he wasn't a cruel ruler. He was simply a victim of his own mind, unable to stop the decline of his empire. Charles's reign ended in failure, not because of his decisions, but because he was trapped inside a mind that betrayed him. His death did little to heal the wounds his mental illness had inflicted on France. Number 18. The Dark Legacy of Queen Isabella of Spain. Let's head to Spain, where Queen Isabella I, often remembered for her role in the Spanish Inquisition, forged a legacy that would haunt her country for centuries. Isabella wasn't just a queen, she was a force of nature, wielding her power with ruthless religious zeal and political ambition. In 1492, Isabella and her husband, King Ferdinand II, united Spain and embarked on a mission to spread Catholicism across the country. But Isabella's vision of religious unity came at a terrifying cost: the forced conversion of Jews and Muslims. Her greatest atrocity came with the Spanish Inquisition, a systematic hunt for anyone who was seen as a heretic. Thousands of Muslims, Jews, and Protestants were tortured, forced to confess, and executed. The Inquisition wasn't just a religious trial, it was a political tool used to solidify Isabella's hold over her kingdom. Isabella believed that by purging Spain of any religious minorities, she was saving the soul of her nation. But in doing so, she created a legacy of fear and intolerance. Her reign left a trail of bloodshed, a reminder of how the zeal for purity can destroy lives. Despite her efforts to be remembered as a great monarch, Isabella's legacy is tainted, her name forever linked with the suffering she caused in the name of faith. The cost of her religious fervor was too high, and Spain would never be the same again.
Number 19. The downfall of King Louis XVI of France. The fall of a weak monarch. Narrative WebSocket. Now let's look at a monarch whose downfall was less about power and more about incompetence. King Louis XVI of France. Unlike the tyrants we've seen before, Louis XVI's reign wasn't marked by cruelty or ambition. It was marked by weakness and an inability to adapt to a rapidly changing world. Louis inherited the throne at a time when France was on the brink of revolution. The country was deep in debt, and the people were starving. But instead of addressing the issues of his kingdom, Louis focused on the luxury of the court and the stability of the monarchy. His indecision led to mounting unrest, and the people began to turn against him. Louis's attempt to flee Paris and seek refuge in Varennes was the turning point. His failure to maintain control over his kingdom led to his arrest and subsequent execution by guillotine. The French Revolution had taken down a king who, rather than fight for his country, had chosen to ignore the very people he was supposed to rule. Louis XVI's fall from power wasn't due to tyranny. It was due to his inability to rule effectively. His weakness cost him his life, and it cost France its monarchy. Number 20. The tragic tale of King Henry VI. A king who lost his mind and his kingdom. Next, we meet another tragic king, Henry VI of England, whose mental instability would doom both his reign and his country. Henry VI was a king who never wanted to rule. He ascended the throne as an infant and was unable to assert his own authority as a young man. As he grew older, his mental health began to deteriorate. Henry would suffer from long periods of catatonia, where he would sit in a stupor, unable to communicate or make decisions. His reign was marked by his inability to lead, and England descended into civil war as factions vied for control. His madness led to a breakdown in the monarchy, as his inability to make crucial decisions created chaos. In the end, Henry was overthrown by his cousin, Edward IV, and imprisoned. Henry VI's death was a tragic end to a reign defined by weakness and insanity. His legacy is one of a king who never had the strength to rule, and whose madness devastated England during a time of great turmoil. Final thoughts. The corruption of power and the madness of rulers. So, what do we see when we look at these rulers, Tiberius, Mary I, Isabella, and Louis XVI? These were men and women who rose to power but were consumed by their own madness or weakness. In the case of Tiberius, we saw a ruler who was driven mad by his lust for control, turning into a paranoid tyrant. Mary I's reign was marked by religious fanaticism and bloodshed. Isabella's religious zealotry destroyed lives in the name of purity, and Louis XVI, well, his downfall came not from cruelty, but from a failure to understand the world around him. Commercially, each of these rulers shows us the danger of unchecked power, whether it's driven by paranoia, ideology, or incompetence. Power, when misused, destroys not just those in power, but the kingdoms and people they rule. And that's the story of rulers who were consumed by power, ultimately destroyed by their own madness. What began as a gift, a crown of glory, ended as a curse that consumed them and everyone around them. But this isn't just some ancient history, it's a warning. What happens when someone is given absolute power? What happens when that desire to control replaces their humanity? Think about it. These were ordinary people, just like us, who allowed their ambition and fears to twist them into monsters. If they could fall so far, could it happen to any of us? What can we learn from their madness and their downfall? Don't just be a spectator. Join the conversation. Drop a comment below and tell me, which ruler do you think was the most corrupted by power? Does power always lead to destruction, or is there another path? Hit like if this video has made you think, or if you feel unsettled by the lessons we've learned. And don't forget to subscribe to My History Dreams, because there's so much more dark history to uncover. And remember, history always repeats itself. Who knows, maybe we all have a little bit of power that could change the course of our own fate.